For those of you coming to us for the first time, let me say that our program opened last Monday with 3 lectures. Simon Schama spoke insightfully on British Jewish artists, especially David Bomberg, who responded to Rembrandt in their own work. Mirjam Knotter took us on an instructive walk through Rembrandt's neighborhood, introducing us to his patrons and fellow artists and his Jewish neighbors. Bart Vallet gave an illuminating expose on the Ashkenazi community, whose members also lived in the streets around Rembrandt's house. The talks were followed by a roundtable discussion between the speakers in that session and the others. Today, too, a discussion like that will be held. In it, your own questions can be introduced. So don't be shy, just type your questions into the chat at the bottom of the screen, and we will introduce them at the appropriate spots in our own discussions. Today's 3 talks, I feel, complement each other beautifully. Michael Zell places Rembrandt and his Jewish neighbors into their wider Amsterdam surroundings. He introduces questions that have newly come to the fore, issues of discrimination and morality, even the ethics of art history and museum presentations. Steve Nadler homes in on the 2 Jews in Rembrandt's environment about whom we are most curious in terms of their possible relationship to Rembrandt, Rabbi Menasseh ben Israel and the great philosopher Baruch Spinoza. Shelley Perlove enlarges the scope of our discourse to encompass all the religious and social issues shared by Rembrandt as a Christian artist and the Jews of his time. To our first speaker, Michael Zell is a professor of art history at Boston University. He is the author of one of the most original and thought-provoking books on Rembrandt in recent history, Reframing Rembrandt, Jews and the Christian Image in 17th Century Amsterdam. Taking it to hand, I was surprised to see that it was published as long ago as 2002. Looking into it, it is always a fresh experience. The issues it discusses, matters of theology, religious politics, Christian and Jewish messianism, and their impact on art, are not things that can ever be resolved, so that you remain in discussion with Michael concerning them. Michael Zell's research has not stopped there, and it pleases us greatly that today he's taking on another highly significant circumstance new to Rembrandt studies. That is, the diversity of the ethnic and cultural environment of Rembrandt's Amsterdam, how the artist responded to it, and what this means to us and our contemporary responses. Michael.
Thank you very much, Gary, for that very generous introduction. And thank you, Gary and Mirjam, and everyone at the Jewish Museum and Tolerance Center for the invitation to participate in this event and in the exhibition. I am very privileged to be here, and I've already learned a tremendous amount and look forward to hearing the talks of all of the other speakers. So let me begin by sharing my screen. How are we doing? Good. Okay.
Great.
That Rembrandt portrayed the Jews he encountered in the streets of his Amsterdam neighborhood was acknowledged early on. Adriaan van der Werf, a near contemporary who appears to have been well informed, reported in the early 18th century that Rembrandt, quote, turned the picturesque tronies, using the term for paintings of social and ethnic types, of the Jodenbreestraat, the Jew street, to good advantage. Tronies, non-portrait studies, usually of a single figure, sometimes dressed in flamboyant costume, as in a Polish nobleman from 1637, constitute a significant proportion of Rembrandt's production. To be sure, the identification of some of these pictures as Jews, as rabbis, old men, and Jewish brides became grossly inflated in the 19th century, as Gary Schwartz reminded us last week. And identifying Jewish sitters on the basis of dress, let alone physiognomy, is notoriously problematic. But two likely candidates, based on modern scholarly consensus, are the Berlin Portrait Study of a Young Jew from 1648, and especially the Kimball's Bust of a Young Jew from 1663. That Rembrandt's contemporaries recognized and collected thronies of Jewish subjects is also confirmed by a 1681 inventory description of a painting as a, quote, portrayal of a Polak Jew, using the derogatory term smouse. Rembrandt also incorporated studies of contemporary Jewish models in his biblical scenes that blur the distinction between the past and the present. In the 1659 Peter and John healing the cripple at the gate of the temple, the etching, two Ashkenazi Jewish men at the left intently watch the unfolding of the Christian miracle. Rembrandt lived on the Jodenbreestraat, the Jews' Street, as Van der Werf called the St. Antoniusbreestraat, from the early 1630s through 1658, the period when it was becoming the epicenter of Amsterdam's Jewish community, initially with Sephardic converso immigrants from Iberia and other parts of the Spanish and Portuguese Empire, and then with growing numbers of Ashkenazi Jews from Central and Eastern Europe, as Bart Vallet discussed last week. While the St. Antoniusbreestraat was a fashionable street favored by painters and art dealers, already in 1640, the Englishman Peter Mundy called it the Jode Street, or Jew Street. He commented that the Sephardim living on and around the street are, quote, esteemed of, living in liberty, adding that they allow pictures in their houses and that some were themselves artists. Mundy's reporting is reliable. Archival documentation confirms the presence of paintings in Sephardic households, as Mirjam Knotter detailed with exciting new evidence in her talk last week. The Sephardic physician Ephraim Bueno, who Mirjam showed us was Rembrandt's close neighbor, commissioned portraits of himself from both Rembrandt, as we see here. This is the etching of 1647, though there's also the painted oil sketch that preceded it, both Rembrandt and Jan Liefens. And the Jewish artist Salom Italia is best known for his engraved portraits of Rabbi Menasseh ben Israel on the right, and also Judah Leon Templo. This much is well-known territory. But the historian Mark Ponte's remarkable new archival discoveries are transforming our image of Rembrandt's neighborhood from a mixed quarter populated by Jews, artists, art dealers, merchants, into an urban landscape increasingly recognized and labeled as multicultural. Ponte demonstrated the presence of a small but visible community of free Black Africans living in the vicinity of the Jodenbreestraat from the 1630s onwards, which reached its apogee in the late 1650s and therefore coincided with Rembrandt's residence on the street. Some of these Black people were mariners or soldiers involved in Dutch maritime trade, but most were servants of the Sephardim originally brought to Amsterdam as slaves. Ernst Brink, later mayor of Harderwijk, recorded in the early 17th century that, quote, almost all of the servants of the Portuguese Jews of Amsterdam are slaves and Moors, the term commonly used to refer to Black Africans. Remained Hoge's late 17th century etching of the Pinto House on the Jodenbreestraat, which still survives, shows a Black manservant here attending the family of Isaac de Pinto as they leave the house for an awaiting carriage. Slavery was officially banned in the Dutch Republic, so from the standpoint of domestic law, slaves were in principle free as soon as they stepped foot in the country. But enslaved people had to apply for their freedom through Amsterdam's municipal court, as was the case with a Black woman named Zebelina, who had been brought to Amsterdam with the Sephardic Jew Simon Correa. In 1642, she and her children were granted their freedom in a notary's office. Since the initiative lay with the enslaved person, who may not have had the capacity nor the compliance of their owners to seek their freedom through legal channels, their status remained vulnerable. In 1656, a Black woman named Juliana, who had been brought from Brazil to Amsterdam by Eliao de Burgos, fled rather than move with his family back to Barbados, where she would have returned to a life of slavery. In 1659, the Afro-European woman Deborah Nasi, a servant in the household of the Sephardic Jew David Nasi, wisely had her freedom certified before traveling with the family to the Guyanas. Nasi declared before an Amsterdam notary that Deborah, described, quote, as being brown, a brown female or mulatto, was a free woman, quote, conceived and born in freedom and also raised as such without anyone in the world having any kind of claim on her person, end quote. Deborah's action was crucial, for while slavery was illegal in the Republic, it was widely condoned and practiced throughout the Dutch trading and colonial empire. With the West India Company's seizure of northeastern Brazil and parts of West Africa from the Portuguese between 1636 and 44, the Dutch became actively involved in provisioning the slave labor deemed essential for the hugely profitable sugar industry. For a few decades, the Dutch were the dominant slave traders in the world. David Nasi, who, as we saw, affirmed his servant Deborah Nasi's freedom, had been a slave owner in Brazil in the 1640s, returning to Amsterdam in the earlier part of the 1640s before its recapture by the Portuguese in 1654. But in 1660, he embarked with his family and Deborah for Cayenne, Guyana, then in Dutch hands, and after its fall to France in 1664, moved to Suriname, which became a Dutch colony in 1667. In 1681, his son Samuel owned 80 slaves who labored on his sugar plantations. By 1693, that number had more than doubled. No trace of the brutal and dangerous working conditions of enslaved Africans is visible in Dirk Valkenburg's pastoralized representation of a Surinamese sugar plantation from the early 18th century. But let's return to the interwoven lives of the Dutch Sephardim and Black Amsterdammers in Rembrandt's neighborhood. As ex-conversos from Iberia and its empire, the Sephardim were accustomed to the elite practice of owning Black slaves as domestic servants. A memento mori from about 1682 by Benjamin Senior Godinez shows a wealthy Sephardic man accompanied by his Black slave or servant boy. Affective ties sometimes develop between the Sephardim and their African slaves and servants, which of course does not diminish the abhorrence of the Sephardim's ownership of human beings. A Black man named Eliezer, who was brought to Amsterdam from Portugal in 1610 with his master Paulo de Pina, must have converted to Judaism because he was buried in the Beit Chaim cemetery at Ouderkerk outside the city in 1629. I'm showing here Abraham Blotling's 1670 etching after Jacob van Rausdel's drawing of the Jewish cemetery. In 2002, Lydia Hagort discovered Eliezer's headstone with the Portuguese inscription, quote, grave of the good servant, or servo, next to that of his master de Pina and alongside Jacob Israel Belmonte, one of the Sephardic community's most prominent members. Eliezer also attended the funeral of his master's wife, Sarah, when she died in 1621, pledging on that occasion to contribute 6 stalvers in her memory. As Holland's oldest known grave of a former slave, Eliezer's grave has since become the site of an annual pilgrimage in his honor, known as Eliezer's Day. And in 2013, a statue of Eliezer by the Surinamese sculptor Erwin de Vries was erected at the cemetery entrance. Controversy between Jewish and Black leaders has also flared over whether the site marks the atrocities of slavery or the possibilities of tolerance. While Eliezer was assigned a grave in the cemetery's prestigious section, other converted Black or mulatto slaves or servants were buried in a part of the cemetery reserved for servants and non-Sephardic Jews, or Ashkenazi Jews. In 1647, a separate segregated section was designated for Black and mulatto Jews. So what bearing does awareness of this population of Black Africans, mostly interwoven with the Sephardic Jews, have for our understanding of Rembrandt and the environment in which he lived? As with the Jews he encountered in his neighborhood, Rembrandt was drawn to the Black people he saw as models for his art. Among these works is the etched bust of an African woman, about 1631, an unusually elaborate colored drawing of 2 African drummers, perhaps based on observation of a parade in The Hague, a small sketch of a Black man, and the extraordinary painting, 2 African Men, dated 1661. Marc Ponte has tentatively identified the models for this painting as the brothers Bastian and Manuel Fernando from the island of San Tomé, who served the Amsterdam Admiralty as sailors. In 1657, Bastian is recorded as residing at the end of the Jodebreestraat down the street from Rembrandt, together with his wife Maria from Angola and their daughter Lucia. It's a stunning possibility. In fact, Rembrandt depicted Black people more often than any other 17th century artist. Like the Jewish figures in his work, although less frequently, Black Africans feature most regularly in biblical scenes. In the Visitation of 1640, for example, a Black woman, who's a servant, stands on her toes as she removes Mary's mantle. Jews and Black Africans appear together in the St. John the Baptist preaching of circa 1633 to 34, a grisaille probably conceived as the model for a print that was never executed. To move this around. 3 men in the foreground over here, dressed in elaborate Orientalizing garb, are explicitly identified as Jews. One wears a shawl over his head, inscribed with illegible Hebrew letters. At least 2 Black men are behind John, one here and another here. And another in an exotic headdress is next to the recumbent figure of an Indian with a quiver on his back. In this unprecedented image, Rembrandt also introduced among the crowd a soldier in Japanese armor, over here, a Muslim in a turban on the right, and an indigenous American identified by his feathered headdress, signifying St. John's preaching to the entire known world. I'll return to the distinctive role Rembrandt assigned to these Jewish figures a little later. This convergence of Jews and Black Africans in Rembrandt's art and the disturbing truth of the 2 communities' ties through the institution of slavery complicates profoundly the application of the label multicultural to Rembrandt's neighborhood. Clearly, the modern idea of multiculturalism, or the social and political inclusion of people of diverse ethnicities, races, and faiths, falls far short of the lived realities of Black Amsterdammers, Black Jewish relations, and the experiences of the Dutch Sephardim. Despite enjoying unparalleled freedoms, They were not confined to a district of the city, nor required to wear distinguishing dress. Jews were still prohibited from practicing trades and professions regulated by the guilds, among other restrictions. It's critical to acknowledge, moreover, that Dutch Jews saw no contradiction between their struggle for equal status and their enslavement of Black Africans. While the exaggerated claims of Jewish representation in the Atlantic slave trade of the 1990s have thankfully receded, the fact remains that Jews participated actively in this barbaric system. While Christians overwhelmingly dominated the slave trade, Jews, who made up about a third of the white population in the Dutch colonies of Brazil, Suriname, and Curaçao, maintained a high profile in the slave system. The deeply hierarchical social structures of early modern Europe, including the Dutch Republic, unsurprisingly were self-perpetuating. And Jewish slaveholding, as Jonathan Sorsch writes, quote, marks a superb instance of the power of hegemonic discourse at work. Natalie Zeman-Davis has also recently shown that the Sephardim in Suriname made a clear distinction between their own biblical exodus out of slavery and the fate of the Africans they enslaved. So how to accommodate Rembrandt into this emerging picture of Black presence in the Jodebreestraat area and the disturbingly entangled histories of Dutch Jews and Black people? The stakes are high, given Rembrandt's continued stature as an artist whose work is believed to transcend stereotyping and difference, to reveal the commonalities between all people. However true or untrue, as Simon Schama put it last week, Rembrandt's reputation for compassion and empathy is bound up with the possibilities of tolerance, as is the Jewish Museum and Tolerance Center itself. Such questions have become more urgent in the wake of the important exhibitions Black in Rembrandt's Time at the Rembrandt House of 2020 and Slavery at the Rijksmuseum of 2021. In these public reckonings with Dutch colonial history and involvement with slavery, Rembrandt and his Amsterdam neighborhood took center stage. The monumental pendant portraits of the wealthy Martin Solmans and Opia Koppert from 1634, which commemorate their marriage in the previous year, were displayed prominently in the slavery exhibition. Since Martin owned a sugar refinery in Amsterdam, the couple's wealth derived from the slave labor used on the sugar plantations of Dutch Brazil. Martin died young in 1641, and 6 years later, Opia married Martin Day, a soldier who had served in Brazil from 1629 to 41, during which time he fathered a daughter with an African woman named Francisca, whom he had raped and continued to abuse thereafter. By centering the role of slavery in the lives of these people, the exhibition curators hoped to change visitors' perceptions of Rembrandt's paintings. Do we now look differently at the portraits of Opia and Martin, the catalog asks? And in response, probably we do. Yet Jonathan Jones, art critic for The Guardian newspaper, was shocked by Rembrandt's inclusion in the exhibition. After all, he writes, there is no artist more overflowing with compassion and empathy than Rembrandt. Yet this exhibition reveals a side of the painter's career that sits badly with our view of him as an artist with an expansive vision of what it means to be human. Was Rembrandt in some way complicit in showcasing Martin and Opia's wealth with the blingiest, most extravagantly expensive clothing and jewels, since they owed their prosperity to the horrors of slavery? Struggling with the implication, Johnson appeals to Rembrandt's depictions of Jews to come to the rescue. Quote, Rembrandt is credited with a moral insight that goes beyond the conventions of his day. He portrayed Jewish people with sensitivity in an age of anti-Semitism. Surely he didn't just happily take the sugar money and give the couple what they wanted. Rembrandt's reputation as a moral exemplar still hinges then on his portrayals of and presumed sympathy for Jews, whose history in the Dutch Republic and its colonies is hopelessly intertwined with the slave trade. Johnson mobilizes this interrelationship, though does not acknowledge its complexities, when he turns to the two African men as evidence of Rembrandt's morality. The subjects, Johnson writes, may be Rembrandt's neighbors. Anyway, he portrays them with empathy. The two men, he continues, project, quote, an overpowering air of loss, as if trying to find their place in a broken world, sensing the stain of slavery on Europe and its ramifications. The contrast with Rembrandt's portraits of the, quote, sugar-rich couple, Martin Solmans and Opia Kopit, Johnson emphasizes, could not be more striking. In these grand assertions of wealth and status derived from slave labor, he writes, Rembrandt shows us exactly what they are. Rich non-entities using the veneer of wealth to conceal their vacuity, or something much worse. Setting aside for the moment whether Johnson's position can be sustained on historical grounds, Rembrandt emerges here as a heroic figure whose images transcend social as well as artistic conventions to reveal a deeper truth beyond religious, ethnic, and racial difference, and therefore beyond the contingencies of history itself. It's a powerful proposition rooted in the afterlife of Rembrandt's portrayal of and relationship with Jews, especially among German Jewish scholars before and after World War II. In 1920, Urban Panofsky transformed Rembrandt into an artistic hero whose late images of Jews, such as this, erase ethnic and religious difference to reveal a universal human essence. Quote, here we see expressed the timeless and unfathomable depth of a soul, which beyond the borders of individual consciousness has been subsumed into a consciousness of all. The late Rembrandt gives the human being such depth as to make it give up its individuality in God. Conversely, from this time, he discovers God in the human being itself. Franz Landsberger, a German Jewish emigre to America, made his personal attachment to this construct explicit in his Rembrandt, the Jews, and the Bible of 1946. Quote, it has often proved a comfort to me in this era of European Jewish tragedy to dwell upon the life and work of Rembrandt. Here was a man of German ancestry who did not regard the Jews of the Holland of his day as a misfortune, but approached them with friendly sentiments, dwelt in their midst, and portrayed their personalities and ways of life. He was the first to have the courage to use the Jews of his environment as models for the heroes of sacred narratives. I have frequently referred to these remarkable facts in lectures delivered in Germany and later in America, and have felt it incumbent upon me to convey to others the solace I have experienced in their contemplation. I desired also to furnish my co-religionists with an understanding of what Rembrandt had done for them, and to bring to them a recognition of their debt to his art. Landsberger's book exerted an enormous impact on subsequent Rembrandt scholarship. Writing in 1948, Jacob Rosenberg asserted, there remains the indisputable fact that the artist's attitude to the Jewish people was an unusually sympathetic one. The post-Holocaust elevation of Rembrandt as a paragon of morality, whose art could serve as a source of consolation and inspiration for Jews, resonates strongly with Rembrandt's reception amidst today's effort to promote dignified portrayals of Black people as alternatives to the dominance of their stereotyping in the history of art. Stephanie Archangel, one of the curators of Black in Rembrandt's time, stated explicitly, for years I've been searching from my Curacao background in paintings and other works for Black people in which I could recognize myself. In Rembrandt's work, I finally found them. His paintings, drawings, and prints make it clear that he paid little, if any, heed to slavery or Black humility either. Thus, just as the histories of Dutch Jews and Black people are inescapably linked to slavery, the afterlives of Rembrandt's representations of Jews are implicated, consciously or not, in the desire to enlist his work in today's post-colonial project to reckon with Dutch participation in the slave trade and the enduring effects of racism. Yet while Rembrandt's portrayals of the Jews and Black Africans he encountered in his neighborhood bear witness to the interconnections between these two communities, however fraught, looking at his artworks from an historical vantage point challenges their utility as models of morality and tolerance. Rembrandt sometimes casts Jews in biblical scenes as hostile to the Christian message of salvation, as is the case with the St. John the Baptist preaching, which we saw earlier. The three prominent Jews in the foreground are the only figures to turn their backs on John and speak conspiratorially among themselves. This characterization persists in the late etching Peter and John healing the cripple, albeit in more muted form. And again, there are the two Ashkenazi Jewish men at the left. Rembrandt similarly complied with stereotype convention when depicting Black people as servants to elite whites, as we saw with the visitation with the Black woman servant on her toes over here. And returning to St. John the Baptist preaching, the Black men in the crowd, recall here, here, and here, unlike the Jews, listen intently to John's words, signifying their potential incorporation as converts to Christianity within the increasingly interconnected world of Rembrandt's time. So paintings such as these are exceptional, even within Rembrandt's own work. In contrast to other artists' stereotyped renderings of Jews and Black figures, which usually emphasize exoticism and otherness, Rembrandt focuses sensitively on the men's facial expressions and inner lives. Yet this is, of course, a typical feature of Rembrandt's later art, epitomized by the so-called Jewish bride, probably the biblical couple Isaac and Rebekah, in which the figures' intimacy and interiority are evoked through their downward gazes and gently touching hands. The paintings are fully consistent, moreover, with Rembrandt's combination of vivid lifelikeness based on direct observation of the model rather than convention and painterly virtuosity. To interpret them as straightforward evidence of Rembrandt's sensitivity to or compassion for people of color or his sympathy for Jews is therefore questionable and probably ahistorical. However, as Elmer Colfin rightly argues in relation to the two African men, paintings carry many truths. This is a quote. Paintings carry many truths. They have a unique capacity to become a mirror that brightly reflects our own concerns, helping us to deal with them. And that is invaluable. Artworks of this caliber have the power to defy the fixity of their historical origin points and to operate in multiple temporalities. Alexander Nagel and Christopher Wood have written compellingly about the capacity of artworks to, quote, belong to more than one historical moment simultaneously, end quote, serving as material residues of the past that at the same time exist and exert agency in the present. We as viewers activate and reactivate the artwork, entering into conversations across time that are potentially, as Nagel and Wood suggest, more meaningful than a merely forensic reconstruction of the past. If we partner with Rembrandt's unarguably sensitive portrayals of Jews and Black people in works such as these by suspending an exclusively historical mindset in favor of one shaped by other priorities, the possibility of their symbolic reach extends beyond 17th century Amsterdam to symbolize possibilities unknown even to Rembrandt himself. Thank you.
Wow. There's a lot to think about, a lot to discuss. These are very profound issues, and I'm really grateful for your bringing them so pointedly and eloquently, Michael. Our next speaker, Stephen Nadler, is Willis Research Professor and the William H. Hague II Professor of Philosophy at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where he is also an affiliate in the Department of Art History and in the Moss Weinstein Center for Jewish Studies, and director of the Institute for Research in the Humanities. It is not for nothing that he bears all those titles and affiliations. He has made signal contributions to each of these fields. In philosophy, his contributions range from technical investigations into the thinking of Spinoza, René Descartes, Nicolas de Malebranche, not to miss him, and others, destined for recondite scholarly journals, to the graphic nonfiction book, Heretics, the Wondrous and Dangerous Beginnings of Modern Philosophy, for which his son Ben provided the art. And that can be found on newsstands everywhere. A recent high point in Stephen Nadler's work in Jewish studies is his life of Menasseh ben Israel in the Yale series on Jewish lives, to be recommended. Menasseh also plays the key role in Nadler's art historical book, Rembrandt's Jews, and in recent groundbreaking articles with Victor Turibas on Menasseh's messianic book, Piedra Gloriosa, for which Rembrandt made 4 etchings. Steve Nadler has graciously agreed to speak on Jews with whom we could not do without, Menasseh ben Israel and Baruch Spinoza. Steve.
Thanks very much, Gary. Let me get my screen sharing here. All right. Thanks, Gary. Thanks to Gary and Mirjam for inviting me, and Leah for inviting me to participate in this wonderful series of symposia. And thanks also to Marina and all the staff in Moscow for their great technical expertise. A major challenge when addressing the topic of Rembrandt and Judaism, including the question of his personal, and artistic relationships with his Jewish neighbors in Amsterdam, is separating sober facts from romantic fictions. Myths and exaggerations abound, some based on evidence ranging from meager to compelling, and others grounded in mere wishful thinking. To take just one example, the Dutch Jewish historian Moses Gans, writing in 1971, insists that Holland's Jews owe Rembrandt, quote, an enormous debt of gratitude, for there has never been another non-Jewish artist to depict this rejected group of people as truthfully as did Rembrandt. The facts, at least, are fairly clear. From 1632 to 1658, with a brief hiatus, Rembrandt lived in the neighborhood that included the Vlooienberg Island and the main, more upscale boulevard on which he resided, the St. Anthony's Breestraat, later called the Jodenbreestraat, or the Jews' Broad Street. This was the relatively new quarter of the city that, around the beginning of the 17th century, began settling growing numbers of first Sephardic Jews, mainly converso refugees from the Spanish and Portuguese Inquisitions and their descendants, and later Ashkenazim, who were fleeing violent persecution and economic hardship in Central and Eastern Europe. But Rembrandt did not choose to live here because it was a Jewish neighborhood. Rather, the Breestraat at the time was the center of Amsterdam's art world and home to many artists and art dealers, including the dealer and workshop master Hendrik van Arlenberg, with whom Rembrandt worked and lodged on his arrival in Amsterdam from Leiden, whose cousin, Saskia, he would marry in 1634. We also know, or in some cases have at least very compelling reason to believe, that Rembrandt did indeed have artistic and other engagements with some of his Jewish neighbors. First of all, there is a small half-length oil sketch of Ephraim Hezekiah Bueno van Rodrigo, as well as an etched 3/4 length portrait of Bueno based on the painting. So there is the etching. Sorry, there is the painting, and here is the etching. Bueno, a medical doctor and scholar, was a prominent and affluent member of the Portuguese Jewish community. His father, Joseph, had brought the family to Amsterdam from Bayonne, France, where many of the Converso refugees first landed after their escape from Iberia. Bueno was a generous financial supporter of the community's religious and cultural life, including subsidizing the printing of the first Hebrew prayer book to be published in Amsterdam in 1627 by his friend, Rabbi Menasseh ben Israel. Not all of Rembrandt's dealings with his Jewish neighbors were so peaceable. In 1637, Rembrandt and the Portuguese Jewish artist Samuel Dorta were in a legal tussle because Rembrandt had apparently been hawking impressions from the etching plate of Abraham's dismissal of Hagar and Ishmael, after selling the plate to Dorta, on the understanding that Dorta alone would bring prints to the market. In the notary document detailing the dispute, Dorta complains that Rembrandt, quote, had not treated him properly as regards a certain print depicting Abraham and Hagar, of which the aforementioned Van Rijn had sold him the plate, on condition that he had not kept any of the prints, except 2 or 3 which he stated would be for his own use and curiosity. But whether many or a few, he would not sell them to anyone. That at least was the agreement. Another dispute, this one extending from early 1653 into the spring of 1654, concerned the noise and cost of the improvements that Rembrandt's next-door neighbor, the merchant Daniel Pinto, was making to his house, including a shared wall of their adjacent homes. The arrow indicates the 2 homes next to each other, Rembrandt's and Pinto's. Pinto, presented with a bill from the lumber merchant, Peter Peterson, for 729 guilders, complained that he was bearing all the cost of the renovation, despite an early agreement that some of the cost would be shared between him and Rembrandt. Peterson replied that, quote, it was none of his business and did not wish to seek any money from Rembrandt. While these repairs were going on in 1654, another Jewish resident of the neighborhood, in this case a member of the Hochdeutsch or German congregation, one Eliezer Schwab, was stealing from the rear cellar of Rembrandt's house some rolls of tobacco that Pinto, who was renting the cellar, was storing there for the Portuguese Jews Jacob and Samuel Pereira. The thefts took place over the course of 6 weeks, usually early in the morning. 1654 seems, in fact, to have been an especially bad year for Rembrandt's relations with his Sephardic neighbors. For that February, there was another quarrel with a, quote, Portuguese merchant, Diego d'Andrada. D'Andrada had commissioned from Rembrandt a portrait of a young woman, perhaps his daughter, who was about to leave Amsterdam for Hamburg, home to another well-established Sephardic community. What d'Andrada saw in the finished painting, for which he had paid a 75 guilder deposit, did not satisfy him, and he now wanted Rembrandt to alter and retouch the painting or portrait before the departure of the young woman, so that it would be her proper likeness. Otherwise, he had no interest in the painting, and Rembrandt, that is, d'Andrada, had no interest in the painting, and Rembrandt would have to keep it for himself and reimburse d'Andrada the deposit. Rembrandt refused, saying that he would not do a thing to the painting until d'Andrada paid him the balance due or guaranteed full payment by giving a security. Rembrandt also suggested that, because it was his word against d'Andrada's whether the portrait looked like the woman, they should submit the matter to the board of the city's Guild of St. Luke for their judgment. And Rembrandt agreed that if the board decided that there was not enough resemblance, he would alter the painting. And if d'Andrada was still not satisfied, Rembrandt would agree to keep it for auction at his next sale of works. By far, the individual to whom most studies of Rembrandt's relationships to Jews and Judaism give the greatest attention is Menasseh ben Israel. This is not Menasseh. Menasseh was among the rabbis of the three Portuguese Jewish congregations that existed in Amsterdam in the early decades of the 17th century. When these congregations united into the single Talmud Torah congregation in 1639, Menasseh was appointed. I'm sorry, I shouldn't be showing you that. There's Menasseh. When these congregations united into the single Talmud Torah congregation in 1639, Menasseh was appointed third in rank of the four rabbis, but by far the worst paid. He was also a prolific writer and printer of Judaica, and arguably the most famous Jew in Europe in the period. Gentile scholars from all over Europe consulted him on Jewish theological and philosophical topics. Now, Menasseh was certainly not, as some have asserted, Rembrandt's neighbor on the Breestraat, or living in a house across the street, as some have said. However, the two men did live in the same neighborhood and not very far from each other. While Rembrandt was living on the Breestraat, Menasseh resided in and ran his printing business from a house on the Nieuwe Houtmacht, a vague designation for somewhere on the Wallenberg Island. Or, as Mirjam Alexander-Kanader suggested last week, perhaps Menasseh was living elsewhere in the neighborhood, that is, with his brother-in-law, Jonah Abravanel. As Simon Schama once reminded me, this was not a very large quarter of the city, and thus it was easy to believe that such prominent individuals as Rembrandt and Menasseh knew each other, or at least knew of each other, and no doubt they occasionally passed one another in the street. And they also had some mutual acquaintances, including Dr. Bueno. One item typically offered as a reason for thinking that there was more than a passing familiarity between the artist and the rabbi is an etching that Rembrandt made in 1636, one that appears in Edmé François Guersin's 1751 Catalogue raisonné with the label Le Portrait de Juif Menasseh ben Israel. The scholarly consensus now, however, is that this is not a portrait of Menasseh ben Israel. In fact, there's nothing to indicate that it is a portrait of a rabbi or even of a Jew, much less of Menasseh. The identification comes relatively late, originating, it seems, with Guersin himself, who is followed uncritically by later catalogers. More intriguing, however, is an element in a Rembrandt painting for which Menasseh is, on highly plausible grounds, often said to have provided guidance. Sometime in the mid to late 1630s, Rembrandt painted the Belshazzar's feast episode from the book of Daniel. Whoops. In the Bible, Belshazzar is giving a banquet using the vessels of gold and silver that his father, Nebuchadnezzar, had taken from the temple sanctuary in Jerusalem, when all of a sudden a very public vision emerges, a hand writing something on the palace wall. Everyone is puzzled by the apparition, and the Israelite exile Daniel is the only member of the court who can read the message and provide an interpretation. The Aramaic text, he tells the king, says, Mene, mene tekel upharsin, a list of declining units of measure that means essentially, your days are numbered. In Rembrandt's painting, a surprised Belshazzar turns around as a hand emerges from a cloud and writes the message in Hebrew characters. The biblical text does not say why none of the king's guests or ministers could read the words, nor does it give any indication as to the form in which the message was written. And this gave rise to some debate among the ancient rabbis as to how the message must have looked to the confused banqueters. Were the words encrypted in some way? Were they written backward from left to right? Were the letters transposed? Or were the words to be read right to left, but vertically downward rather than horizontally across? This last vertical format of the mysterious text is exactly how it is depicted in Rembrandt's painting. And it is also the only one of the rabbinic explanations that is presented by Menasseh in his discussion of Belshazzar, in his book De Termino Vitae, where he includes a diagram of the words that resembles perfectly the image in Rembrandt's painting. It thus seems very likely that Rembrandt, wondering just how he should depict the divine message in his painting, and perhaps at the recommendation of some acquaintance in the Portuguese Jewish community, walked down the street and over the Houtgracht Bridge to consult with the extroverted rabbi, known for his ecumenical and often very friendly relationships with non-Jews. Menasseh's book was published in 1639, and depending on the dating of the painting, this could be several years after Rembrandt had finished the work. But the theory about the format of the divine writing would have been on Menasseh's mind for a while, and he certainly could have helped Rembrandt with this in person before writing his book. The idea that Menasseh did advise Rembrandt on Belshazzar's feast is thus fairly compelling and represents at least one, albeit probably brief, instance of a collaboration. The project, however, that is most often cited as proof of a working relationship between artist and rabbi is Menasseh's book, Piedra Gloriosa, The Glorious Stone, a messianic treatise that Menasseh published in 1655, just a few months before his departure for England to negotiate the readmission of the Jews to a kingdom from which they had been formerly banned since 1290, and just 2 years before his death. Much of Menasseh's treatise is a commentary on the book of Daniel, which, like the story of Esther, was of great importance in the early modern period to both Jews in the Sephardic diaspora and Judaizing conversos still living in Spain and Portugal. Among other things, Menasseh offers an interpretation of the episode from Daniel in which Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, dreams of a huge and dazzling statue with a head of gold, breast and arms of silver, torso of bronze, legs of iron, and feet of clay and iron, that is then toppled by a boulder. This is from Daniel 2:31-36. In the biblical story, Daniel explains the king's dream as forecasting the doom facing his and subsequent kingdoms. Daniel then foretells of, quote, a kingdom established by the God of heaven that will never be destroyed. It shall shatter and make an end to all those kingdoms, and it shall itself endure forever. It was not very difficult for Menasseh to find messianic import in Daniel's dream interpretation. The stone that crushes the king's statue, hewn from a mountain without the intervention of human hands, he says, represents the Messiah sent by God. Having swept away all the other empires of the world, the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks, and the Romans, represented by the materially composite statue, God will replace them with the kingdom of Israel. This stone, Menasseh says, is the Messiah, a stone that striking the feet of the statue will put an end to all the kingdoms of the fourth monarchy and will become an immense mountain and will fill the world. Remarkably, Menasseh argues that the same stone that topples the statue in Nebuchadnezzar's dream is in fact identical with stones that appear in two other well-known biblical stories. It is the same exact rock as that on which Jacob's head rests while he dreams about angels going up and down a ladder, and which he then sets up as a sacred pillar onto which he pours oil. Then there is the stone with which David, representing the Messiah, slays the Philistine giant Goliath, who stands for both the statue of Nebuchadnezzar and the 4 captivities of Israel. David, Menasseh notes, had 5 stones in his bag. 4 of them are, quote, useless and represent the 4 monarchies. But the 5th one stands for the one that shattered the statue, and it is the same stone on which Jacob poured oil, and the same one of which Daniel spoke. The finale of the treatise is Menasseh's extended discussion of Daniel's vision of the beasts. Daniel relates that during the reign of Belshazzar, he says, I quote, a great sea churned up by the 4 winds of heaven and 4 huge beasts coming up out of the sea. One of the beasts was a lion with eagle's wings. A second was a bear, and a third was a four-headed leopard with four bird wings on its back. But most terrifying of all was a fourth beast, dreadful and grisly, exceedingly strong, with great iron teeth and bronze claws. It differed from all the beasts that preceded it in having 10 horns. One of the horns had, quote, eyes like the eyes of a man and a mouth that spoke proud words. On Manasseh's reading, the four beasts are once again the four doomed kingdoms, while a man whom Daniel describes as coming with the clouds of heaven is the Messiah. His fifth kingdom will be an everlasting worldly dominion, a monarchy of Israel with a Davidic king sent by God ruling all nations under one law. Menasseh was ready to publish his book in Spanish in early 1655. However, he thought it should contain some illustrations. His analyses of the toppling of Nebuchadnezzar's statue, Jacob dreaming of the ladder, David felling Goliath, and especially Daniel's graphic vision of the beast, all of this demanded visual aids. And Menasseh relates that he was responsible for 4 images of just these episodes in the book. Here's what he says in the preface to the reader. Additionally, for better clarity of what is said, I have made 4 figures or images on plates with great propriety. He then describes the 4 illustrated scenes in detail, adding that all of this was costly and required even some work and industry. Now, a number of extant copies of the Piedra Gloriosa do, or at one time did, contain such illustrations. And I count 9 extant volumes that have the illustrations. And these illustrations are 4 separate etched prints of these episodes. But contrary to what one might expect from what Menasseh says in the preface, the prints are not by Menasseh himself, rather, they are by Rembrandt. And this raises quite a few still unresolved questions. Why do Rembrandt's illustrations for this book exist? How did they end up in some, but not all, of the extant bound volumes? And above all, does this represent a true collaboration between Rembrandt and Menasseh? And as is well known, these illustrations were substituted in some of the other volumes with illustrations by another artist. Many commentators have claimed that the rabbi did indeed directly commission the etchings from the artist. Other scholars, however, have questioned whether, or even denied, that Rembrandt produced these images for Menasseh's book at the author's request. One scholar sums up the uncertain state of things well. This is Jasper Hilligers. Taking everything into consideration, did Menasseh and Rembrandt work together or not? If the famous artist was such a good friend, why did Menasseh not name him? Did he turn down his series? Or were Rembrandt's prints bound in at someone else's request? Given the total lack of documentation concerning any kind of working relationship between Rembrandt and Menasseh on this project, as well as the fact that neither man ever mentions the other, all we can really do is speculate. And yet, despite skepticism by some scholars, it does seem extremely likely that there was indeed a collaboration here. When Menasseh says in his preface that I have done 4 figures, or I have made 4 figures on plates, he might seem to be claiming that he himself made etched illustrations for the book. But no prints by his hand appear in any copy, or as far as we know, are extant in any other format. Nor could he, without serious technical training, have produced multiple states of etched plates of such high quality. The more likely reading of the sentence, then, is not that Menasseh made etched plates to 4 images, but that he had some etched plates made according to his vision of what the illustrations should look like, for better clarity of what is said. That is, Menasseh was responsible for designing and perhaps even sketching out what the illustrations should be. And then he then passed all of this along to Rembrandt, who executed the designs in etchings, perhaps with Manasseh's input through the numerous states of the etchings. I should add here too that Victor Terrabas has recently discovered in an archival document that the board of directors of the Portuguese Jewish community in 1655 censored Menasseh's book before its full publication. This is something that we didn't know about before. And so he and I have suggested in an article in the most recent Chroniek van het Rembrandthuis that the reason for this censorship by the Jewish community were Rembrandt's etchings. I turn now finally to someone who'd go on to become the most famous or infamous of Amsterdam's Portuguese Jews. I'm having trouble getting the image there. And this would be Bento or Baruch de Spinoza. Did Rembrandt and Spinoza at one point, both denizens of the Breestraat neighborhood, have anything to do with each other? Many have thought so, or at least wished it to be the case. Unfortunately, there's no evidence whatsoever for any acquaintance, and in fact, it seems highly unlikely. So I'm sorry to disappoint everybody. The future philosopher was born and raised on the Houtgracht, the canal separating Breestraat and the Vlooienburg Island, which is now the Stopopera neighborhood area, and the Waterlooplein. We believe the Spinoza family home was on the Breestraat side of the canal, literally just behind Rembrandt's house. Moreover, Spinoza's father, an importer of dried fruits, was a prominent member of the Portuguese Jewish community. Now, R.W. Valentiner, in his monograph, Rembrandt and Spinoza, notes that, quote, although during a certain period, Rembrandt and Spinoza lived almost next door to each other, and though they had common friends and may well have met at one time or another, they could never have been mutually attracted. This, he insists, is because, quote, these two geniuses were opposed in their philosophy of life. I'm not quite sure what that means. Valentiner goes on to argue that, in fact, Rembrandt and Spinoza did likely meet, with Rembrandt either observing the boy Spinoza in the synagogue or Hebrew school, or encountering him at the house of Menasseh ben Israel, who, besides collaborating with Rembrandt, was likely Spinoza's teacher in the elementary school of the Talmud Torah, elementary level of the Talmud Torah school. Or maybe they met at the home of Franciscus van den Enden, the former Jesuit priest who was Spinoza's Latin teacher, where one of Rembrandt's pupils, Leendert van Beieren, was a lodger. However, Van Beieren died in 1649, before Van den Enden closed his art and book dealership and opened his Latin school, and thus several years before Rembrandt connected with Van den Enden. So that's a non-starter. Still, Valentiner insists on the basis of what he claims were overlapping social and intellectual circles, that it is most likely that Rembrandt met Spinoza there, and he concludes that it can hardly be doubted that they met there more than once, although a closer friendship could probably not develop in view of their fundamentally different conception of religion. That's Valentiner. To all of which I say, almost certainly not. For most of Rembrandt's residency on the Breestraat, Spinoza was a child or an adolescent, and there is no reason why the artist should have taken any special interest in him. And even as a young man in his early 20s, before his cherem or ban from the Portuguese Jewish community for his horrible heresies in 1656, at the age of 7, Spinoza was not the apple of any rabbi's eye. Spinoza apparently quit his formal education in 1649 at the age of 17 and after the death of his older brother Isaac to join his father's importing business. At that point then, he was just another young Portuguese Jewish businessman, of which there were many in Amsterdam. Moreover, within a couple of years of his cherem, well before beginning his philosophical career and achieving any notoriety, he left Amsterdam altogether. Now, in principle, Menasseh could have introduced Rembrandt to Spinoza at some point, but why would he have? Spinoza was, in short, a nobody, a kleine Pischer, as my grandmother would have said, and certainly not yet the great philosopher he would later become. I'm afraid that the idea that Rembrandt and Spinoza had anything to do with each other as intriguing and lovely as an idea as it may be, simply must go the way of all the other myths about Rembrandt or Spinoza. Thank you.
All right. Yeah, thank you for touching all the bases, Steve, and all of the known documented contacts, and also probing each of them and reminding us that as much as we'd love to arrive at conclusions concerning especially relations with Menasseh and possibly with Spinoza, to which you and I were asked to provide a text to put into the pavement in front of the Rembrandt house, talking about the connection between them, telling us again how little assurance we have about these matters. Well, the last speaker today is going to finish off the first half of our program, the sixth out of 12 talks. Shelley, forgive me if I call you the godmother of our theme. No one has published more and more pertinently on Rembrandt and Judaism than you. I will always remember your first visit to me when you revealed to me the anti-Jewish secret of Rembrandt's so-called Faust etching. I have propagated your absolutely convincing interpretation ever since, of course, crediting you every time. I cannot name here your numerous articles, but of course I cannot not name the comprehensive book that you wrote with Larry Silver, one of our speakers next week, Rembrandt's Faith, Church and Temple in the Dutch Golden Age. Allow me to quote my own recommendation of the book, printed on the back of the jacket. Rembrandt's Faith is an important book. It is by far the most comprehensive study to date of a subject that is important not only in Rembrandt studies, but also because of Rembrandt's towering status in the depiction of biblical subjects for the study of religion in early modern culture. Today, we are delighted that Shelley is going to present the synthesis of her ideas of the past decades. It's yours.
Thank you, Gary. That was an amazing introduction. And I do remember that first meeting when I came there, and you got to know that I was such an initiate in terms of Rembrandt studies, coming from Italian art at Bernini and trembling before you, but you were so welcoming and so supportive. And yeah, I was shocked really, because as always, it's not the Rembrandt you may want when you start studying, but it's the Rembrandt that is the truth. And that's what we keep seeking for. So thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you, Mirjam Knoder, and thank you, Marina, for all of your help technically. I am so honored to be here and excited to be here. And I truly fantasize about coming to Moscow for the exhibition. So they say alavai, but I would really love to do that. So listening to these wonderful talks that we just heard today by Michael Zell and Steve Nadler, I just thought I would add something in here to my text, because we're talking about interactions with the Jews, and that's precisely what I'm talking about, Rembrandt and the Jews and vice versa. Very important topic, very rich and very nuanced. And what I want to do is say what I am revealing today has to do with the certain basic connections that Rembrandt, as a Christian, as a great artist of the Bible, over 300 examples of works devoted to that subject, would have, how he would have seen the Jews. What did he take from them? How did he situate them? And so what I'm going to do here, because the book that I wrote with Larry Silver was very, very long, very big, is to concentrate on a few elements here. And so I can't say that I'm covering everything, but there's just so much out there. While not a Philo-Semite, as people in the past believed, Rembrandt nonetheless had an abiding interest in Jews, not only the Hebrews of biblical history, but also those he observed in his midst, who came to Amsterdam to escape the Inquisition in Portugal and the pogroms in Eastern and Central Europe. The famous Dutch artist achieved what I call a semblance of authenticity in the depiction of Judaic ritual garments and the imagined spaces of the Second Temple, and may have even based the face of Jesus on a Sephardic model in his own neighborhood. No other artist of his time achieved this level of attention to such details. This tendency, in general, was noticed by Philipp Angel in 1642, who lauded Rembrandt for his renderings of such details as clothing and objects, but especially for consulting texts for his art, and above all, the Bible. What could account for Rembrandt's apparent interest as a Christian in Jews and Judaism? I have put some quick ideas up on the screen to consider today. One, his interest in the Bible was paramount for his art. Steeped in the reading of Scripture, he portrayed many events of the Hebrew as well as the Christian Testaments, and often consulted the copious notes of the Dutch State Bible translation of 1637 and other texts for his interpretations. Number two, he explored comparisons and connections between Judaism and Christianity in nearly all of his religious works. This will be a major concern in my lecture today. Number three, his interest in the early life of Jesus. Rembrandt, like his compatriots, focused their attention upon the formation of the church during Christ's life as a Jew in the temple, often in comparison with Judaism and in conflict with priests and Pharisees. And let me remind you that this period was a great age of religious dispute. So they're looking for the reform of Christianity in their own time and looking back to the time of Jesus as a model. Number four, nearly all of his religious interpretations were stimulated by the presence of Jews around him, whom he must have viewed as the people of the Bible, whose ancestors lived in ancient times of the Hebrew past and during the era of Jesus. 5, Rembrandt populated his works with images of contemporary Jews, but he also explored and imaginatively exaggerated the picturesque elements of their dress for its exoticism. Slide. Rembrandt's approach to Judaism was grounded in the teachings of St. Paul. The artist literally identified himself with the apostle in his self-portrait of 1661, which may be taken as his profound endorsement of Pauline theology. The artist laid out essential differences, laid out essential differences and oppositions between Christianity and Judaism. Of primary importance were his beliefs that the covenant between God and the Jews was inherited by Christians, and that Judaism, based upon the law, differed from Christianity as a religion of grace conferred through Jesus. Although not actually written by St. Paul, but long associated with his teachings, the book of Hebrews in the New Testament celebrates Christ as the new high priest in heaven who replaced the Jewish high priest on earth. Now, much of what I have just discussed generally conveys how Christians, like Rembrandt, would have viewed Jews. And we will talk more about that rich subject. But what may be said about Rembrandt seen through Jewish eyes, which is the title of this exhibition? And Steve Nadler has talked a bit about this. Slide. Oops, yeah. There's one event in Rembrandt's life that suggests that at least one person, a Sephardic painter, Samuel Daughter, thought that Jews like him might be interested in buying Rembrandt's etchings of Old Testament subjects. In this case, Abraham casting out Hagar of 1637. See that? Daughter purchased from Rembrandt the copper plate for this etching in 1637, but took the artist to court the same year for allegedly violating their agreement not to pull additional impressions from the plate. There he goes, typical Rembrandt, as you heard in Nadler's talk. The subject of the etching would have been appealing to Sephardic Jews in Amsterdam, who had been expelled from many cities while fleeing the Inquisition in Portugal. Rembrandt portrays the moment in which Abraham, commanded by God to listen to his wife Sarah, sadly sends away Hagar and his son Ishmael. Slide. Sarah at the window is joyful and relieved that the covenant will continue with her son Isaac, who stands near her in the doorway, while Rembrandt follows the biblical account by portraying Ishmael in princely garb, since he is destined to be a leader of his people. Isaac in the doorway looks like a shy Jewish schoolboy in Rembrandt's neighborhood. I might also add that Jews in Amsterdam had to send their children to religious school because they were not permitted to attend Christian schools. This event demonstrates God's selection of the Jews as the people of the covenant, as Daughter was right in thinking. Sephardic Jews of Amsterdam would have deeply appreciated Rembrandt's print, but they wouldn't have known St. Paul's interpretation in Galatians 4 that allegorizes the covenant in Isaac and his family as the promise of redemption for Christians, not Jews. Next. The Ashkenazi Jews of Amsterdam would have recognized themselves in Rembrandt's etching of 1648 on the right, Jews in the synagogue. In the same year, an influx of Eastern European Jews arrived to escape the Khmelnytsky massacres in the Ukraine and other persecutions in Eastern and Central Europe. Unlike the Sephardic Jews who dressed like everyone else, the Ashkenazim wore full untrimmed beards with side locks, known as peot or pious, and dressed in long kaftans and floppy and tall hats. The figures in the print resemble the Jews Rembrandt observed in the streets in his neighborhood, as may be seen in his drawing on the left. The pious Jews in the etching discuss and contemplate profound spiritual matters within the synagogue of the Jerusalem temple, as I have argued elsewhere. The number of figures in the etching adds up to 10. The minimum number of men, known as a minyan, required for Jewish worship, so they must be there for service. When the Sephardic Jews applied to live in Amsterdam, Hugo Grotius, a famous Dutch jurist, wrote in 1616 that it would be useful to have Jews in the city so Christians could learn Hebrew from them and study Judaism, the, quote, beginning of the truth, unquote. But he also mentioned the goal of converting Jews from their own texts. Next. The latticed windows, angled walls, and stair landings situate the setting within one of the passageways encompassing the side chambers of the temple on 3 sides, as described in 1 Kings 6, illustrated by Villampondo on the right. You could see those chambers on either side of the central doorway here in this cross section. Most particularly, Rembrandt conveys his own distinctive interpretations of subjects that involve the youthful Jesus in relation to the traditions of Judaism and the temple. These themes address a moment of transition between the institutions of the Jewish tradition and the New Testament. When the young Jesus, raised as a Jew, is initiated into the laws and ceremonies of his ancient faith within the temple. Next. And this is a really important passage from Paul. This Pauline message emphasizes the significance of such subjects in Galatians 4:4, in which Paul states, "The Lord sent his Son, made of a woman, made under the law, that he might deliver them that were under the law." Slide. A biblical event closely related to the initiation of Jesus into Judaism is the presentation of Christ in the temple, a subject that exerted great interest for Rembrandt throughout his career. My focus here, let me just fix that a little bit, is on the artist's rendering of the temple, the priests, rites, and architectural settings and their import. The print of 1630 and a painting of 1631 in The Hague both treat the subject of the presentation of Jesus in the temple. Next, please. The event described in Luke 2 derives from the Jewish requirement that firstborn sons be redeemed from the temple priest. As Mary and Joseph comply with this law, Simeon enters the temple. Inspired by the Holy Spirit, this aged Jew, who had been told that he would live to see the Messiah, suddenly recognizes the infant in his arms as that promised Savior and responds with a song of praise. "Lord, now lettest thou thy servant depart in peace, according to thy word. For mine eyes have seen thy salvation, which thou hast prepared before the face of all people, a light to lighten the Gentiles and the glory of thy people, Israel." Mary is joyful, as you could see in the detail, to hear this news. The widow Hannah, who lived in the temple, also reacts to the Christian revelation in the narrative, though it's not certain if she is the priest looming over the holy figures. Next. In this small print, and when I say print, I mean, when I say small, it's half the size of a postcard. Simeon continues the prophecy and relates that a sword shall pierce through Mary's soul and her son will be spoken against. We do not see the virgin's face, but the sad reaction of one of the female auditors tells us we are in this text. 2 figures at the right, shown and circled in blue, speak against the pronouncement, and some others scoff in disbelief. It's kind of scoffers, disbelievers appear often in these images. Next. Both works, the print and the painting, share details in common, especially their elaborate architectural settings, replete with long staircases, voluminous curtains, and high arched spaces. The sources for these and other details are found in such Jewish writings as the Mishnah and the Mishneh Torah of Maimonides, as well as in the Bible and the histories of Josephus. According to Aaron Katchen, the Mishnah and the Mishnah Torah exerted great interest for Christian Hebraic scholars in the 17th century in the Dutch provinces. Slide. Yet how did Rembrandt come to know Jewish sources? The artist was born in Leiden and resided there until about 1630-31. He even may have briefly attended the university there, which was a major center for the study of Oriental languages, including Hebrew. Most importantly, in 1630, Constantine Lempereur, professor of Hebrew there, translated into Latin the Mishnah Midot on the temple service. This publication appeared with extensive notes and included an architectural plan. The Mishnah Midot was an influential Hebraic source on the temple that described the architectural layout and functions of the complex. The prologue to Constantine's book states that he wished to, quote, shed light on the Old Testament and on our Savior who was in the Temple of Jerusalem. This may explain Rembrandt's motivation in attempting to achieve an authentic temple reconstruction. Slide. A close look at Rembrandt's interpretation enhances our understanding of these works. The detail on the screen from the presentation in the temple print shows a stairway populated by figures who reverentially kneel before a seated high priest, who is accompanied by another, a standing priest to his right. The same two priests appear in a similar position in the painting of the same subject. The identification of the two temple priests may be gleaned from rabbinic sources. According to the Mishnah, the temple had two high priests. The first, the Kohen HaGadol, was the priest who entered the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. The second was the Sechan, who governed the other temple priests. The priestly offices, which alternated between the two priests, are described in the Mishnah Yomah. This source, described by Lempereur in a note, is the only logical explanation for the pairing of these priests in this manner in Rembrandt's works. Moreover, the Sechan stands at the right hand of the Kohen HaGadol, precisely as stated in Sanhedrin 19a. This is pretty specific stuff. As far as I can tell, no other artist before or after Rembrandt produced an image like this of the two temple priests. Another Jewish source, the Mishnah Torah, which describes the many curtains of the gates in the temple, accounts for another predominant element in Rembrandt's temple spaces. And I note here that the curtain is partially open, so there's a sense of a partial revelation, one which is revealed at the crucifixion when the veil of the temple is ripped open. The figures on the staircases have come to the priests to atone their sins, settle disputes, or be purified. The connection between Jewish and Christian atonement is a major theme in Rembrandt's religious works. A major source for the architectural layout of the works discussed here is the plan for the Mishnah Midot. Slide. Rembrandt would not have needed to know Latin to gain information from this book, since Christian Hebraeus would have assisted him, but his own research on the temple was especially enhanced by the centerfold architectural plan that appeared in this publication, which is still in the Leiden University Library, where I found it some years ago. Most significantly, the artist demonstrated special knowledge of the temple, according to Jewish sources, around 1630, the same year as Lempereur's translation. Rembrandt may have produced the works under discussion in response to the interests of Christian Hebraeus in Leiden and Amsterdam who were stimulated by the publication. The plan, at the very least, was clearly instructive for the artist. The architectural setting for Rembrandt's two interpretations may be identified as the Temple Court of Women. The foremost 17th century temple scholar, John Lightfoot, whose Latin texts on the temple were highly popular, maintained in his publication that the presentation of Jesus in the temple took place in the women's court. The writer also included a plan similar to Lemperor's in his book. This space, which I have emphasized in red on the Lemperor plan, was the first enclosure to the east on consecrated ground reserved solely for Jews. As maintained in the Mishnah Midot, the court comprised a square with a chamber in each corner. Each room had a particular function, but most important to my discussion today, the northwest room on the right, the upper right, provided a place for lepers to bathe before being purified by the priests at the top of the stairs. Slide. The gate on the west end was reached by a semicircular staircase, shown as a dark half circle on Lemperor's plan. The red dot on the plan, my red dot, marks the approximate vantage point for both of Rembrandt's work, standing and seeing it from the same exact point. Next. The Court of Women in the Hague painting, with its ornate, eccentric architecture, is as majestic as an opera set. The women's court is defined by a series of arches flanked by stately fluted columns. Opulent floral forms embellish the capitals and the walls surmounting the arches. The ornate beauty and scale of these columns must have been inspired by Josephus, and Rembrandt had a copy of Josephus, who praised the excellence of the, quote, very fine and large pillars of the cloisters in the women's court. That's in Wars 5. The columns in the painting, with their elaborate fluted carvings, however, are fanciful and have little or nothing to do with specific descriptions in temple sources. They are fantastical creations, products of the artist's fertile imagination. Rembrandt is, after all, an artist. Next. Knowing the architectural layout, of Rembrandt's temple setting facilitates the identification of the lame man. Can you see him? Who is cropped at the left edge of the print. Took me a while to figure out what that was. The hobbling figure with a wooden leg may be a leper, exiting the court of women after washing in the bath of the leper's chamber on the right, and then climbing the steps to receive purification from the priest before exiting the temple on the other side. And this is the way you were supposed to enter the temple. You enter on one side, you exit on the other. His lameness anticipates the future healing by Jesus in the temple, as described in Luke 17. So these connections. Next. Rembrandt's presentation in the temple, the oblong print, demonstrates the artist's interest in Jewish ritual garments. Figures in the temple are dressed in garments resembling talit, such as the man conversing at the far left. Slide. A bearded man at the right, and the widow Hannah, who lived in the temple and bore witness to the infant Christ as the anticipated Messiah, are also attired in synagogue dress. The figures wear talit with pendant tied fringes reminiscent of tzitzits. On the left is a print by Jan Lacher of a later date that shows a Sephardic Jew in ritual dress standing in front of the Portuguese synagogue built after Rembrandt's death. And you could see the phylacteries also indicated above tefillin. While none of Rembrandt's renderings of ritual dress are entirely accurate, they are nonetheless suggestive of such garments. The artist may have portrayed them to invoke a synagogue setting and to demonstrate Jewish adherence to the law, as asserted by St. Paul. Next. In the second state of the etching, Simeon, with a full untrimmed beard, wears a dark skull cap or yarmulke that not only accentuates his presence in the scene, but underscores his Jewish identity. Although Calvinist ministers also wore them, which is a very interesting connection with Christianity. Most interesting of all is the lofty turban of the old man standing behind Simeon. The Rembrandt biographer, Van Houbrachen, later wrote that Rembrandt would spend days arranging a turban. Could this be the case here? Or perhaps this is the result of Rembrandt being whimsical in imagining the exotic headgear of a grandfatherly Jewish priest. Next. Rembrandt as an artist and a Christian sought to create a fresh image of the face of Jesus. And I remind you that Calvin said, every Christian must carry an image of Christ in their head. That search was facilitated by sessions with students in his studio who drew after a living model who may have been Jewish. In 2011, I was fortunate to be on the scientific team for an exhibition entitled Rembrandt and the Face of Jesus, which opened at the Louvre and traveled to Philadelphia and Detroit, showcasing 8 oil sketches of the heads of Jesus, originally from Rembrandt's studio, gathered together from many collections for the first time. And I think it was Gary's suggestion to do that. Anyway, next. On the screen are some of these sketches. They have been analyzed meticulously by conservators, and they all say that they're set up the same way. The underpainting is the same, suggesting sessions that were very close together in time. The question is still open as to whether the model for these heads was Jewish. But their faces are different from portrayals by other artists as well as by those by Rembrandt. Rembrandt did take off on this type. Circumstantial evidence exists to support the idea of a Sephardic model. So I'm not giving up on that idea. Next. Next, please. Yeah. Whoops, back. Back. Yeah. And this is a discovery by Gary. A poem by Jan Vos writing about a head of Jesus painted after a Jewish model by Rembrandt student Hovert Flink vents anti-Semitic rancor towards this practice. The poet says that Flink painted his image of Jesus with a closed mouth, since a Jew would only curse Christ if his mouth were open. But the poem, hostile to Jews, suggests that the practice of using a Jewish model did in fact exist. And there's some other things also. Next. The sketched head of Jesus in the Detroit Institute of Arts, which, by the way, was the origin for that show, most closely resembles the figure of Christ in the Louvre Supper at Emmaus of 1648. The biblical narrative in Luke 24 begins when 2 travelers walking along the road to Emmaus are joined by the resurrected Jesus, whom they do not recognize. With the approach of nightfall, the 2 travelers invite the stranger to join them for dinner. And when he blesses and breaks the bread, the disciples recognize him and he miraculously disappears. This is the first appearance after the resurrection. Next. The Paris Emmaus follows visual tradition for this subject by including a waiter, usually considered an unbelieving Jew, who brings food to the table, often a paschal lamb of sacrifice. In this case, however, He serves 2 goat heads for atonement on Yom Kippur, which is told in Leviticus. And I just tell you, when I went to the Louvre, I was assisted by the curator, and we went up on a very tall ladder so I could examine it closely, and he agreed with me. Thus, yet again, Jewish atonement is compared with the redemption through Christ. Next. The 2 disciples in the narrative recognize Jesus in the breaking of bread. As was traditional, the Dürer woodcut, shown on the left, shows a typical figure type for Christ, as he breaks bread in an aura of bright light. And in this detail, he pulls apart a bread loaf with a ritualized gesture invoking the Eucharist. Next. But the Christ in Rembrandt's painting tears off the end braid of challah, a bread especially used by Ashkenazim in Eastern and Central Europe on the Sabbath and holidays, and also used by Jews today for blessing. Usually round, it may be elongated with 5 braids, as it is here. So how did the artist know about this Jewish bread? Next. No, back, yeah. Rembrandt would have been familiar with this annotation in the Dutch State Bible translation for this exact moment in the Bible, which explains that Jesus broke the bread, quote, after the manner of the Jews in the beginning of their meals, whose loaves were so baked that they could easily be broken, unquote. Rembrandt may have also known braided challah from his contacts with Jews in his neighborhood, or maybe he even attended dinner on the Sabbath, or perhaps saw loaves displayed in Jewish bakeries. Challah was in general use in Jewish communities, and with the great influx of Ashkenazi refugees from Eastern Europe around 1648, the year in which the painting was completed, the bread could be found everywhere. Thus, Rembrandt references Jewish customs he observed around him, precisely as he imagined Jesus as a Jew breaking bread. Next. So here again is my list of Rembrandt's interests in Jews, and you can see that I have covered all of them. But let me say, probably the most important among them are the connections the artist explored between Judaism and Christianity. While Rembrandt was neither a theologian nor a biblical scholar, he consulted his Dutch State Bible and other texts for the sake of his art. But he was foremost an artist who reached out to the world around him and portrayed it with religious insight and imagination. Next. Thank you so much, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Shelley. What a rich and wonderful talk with an infinity of subjects to talk about. Well, we can't do it all now. We've had some very nice responses from members of the audience, and I'd like to start off the discussion, which we'll conduct among ourselves. We can only let the audience participate through the chat and Q&A. We have now 277 viewers, which is wonderful, but we have to speak for you. 2 of the questions concerned Blacks, and three of them that I noted. Teresa Posada asked, who was the patron of Rembrandt's painting in the Marat's house of 2 Black men? Wow, if we only knew. That painting has very little provenance and information that we can go on. We all love to know about it. And Michael's suggestion, quoting Mark Ponte, that there might possibly be the 2 Black brothers living down the street from him is so exciting, but as of now, it's still not to be proven. Maybe someday DNA research will reach the point where we can take little pieces of the Rembrandt painting and identify the individuals who sat for them.
And I also, Gary, can I just interject
Right.
since it's about that? There's no reason to necessarily assume that there would have been a patron
No.
for all of Rembrandt's works, and certainly a picture like that. And I think it's
there was another question by Anders Renyi about the black in the Utrecht painting of the baptism of the eunuch. Well, Elmer Colfin came to me maybe 10 years ago after I'd been working on Rembrandt for a long time, and he did a dedicated search through Rembrandt's work and came up with no fewer than 30 images of blacks throughout the work. So it's, and as Michael also pointed out, this is at least as numerous as the images of Jews that we think we found.
One of the things, Gary, I'd like to insert, following up on Michael's point about converts to Judaism in the case of the black servants, is that Rembrandt was particularly interested in the conversion of the eunuch from the book of Acts, chapter 8, if I remember right. And that is also an image of a black converting to Christianity, and raises the significant issue that the John the Baptist picture also raised about the listeners and the sympathy of the black audience for the Christian message.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, Larry, because I happen to have written a book about Rembrandt's images of the baptism of the eunuch. You can all order it from Primavera Press. It's inexpensive and complete in terms of Rembrandt's images. And there was an interesting question by John Reel of Jan Reel. Was there a difference between Ashkenazi and Sephardi attitudes towards blacks and black slavery? Well, I think I can say that we don't know of any attitude by Ashkenazi Jews concerning this subject. I don't think that there were any documented cases of Ashkenazis with black slaves. I think that this was something that the Sephardi brought with them. Yeah, Shelley?
But they were involved in investments, and in Herkmann's the etching that Rembrandt did for Herkmann's, in the background is in praise of shipping, praise of fortune of shipping. In the background, you can see Ashkenazi Jews who are negotiating deals for merchants. That doesn't say much about slavery, but you know, at that period, much of the trade had things to do with slavery indirectly or directly. The Sephardic Jews were mostly in the early years involved as investors. They did some trading. They did not they didn't have plantations until later, like Curator in the Caribbean. That's when it all took off for them. Anyway, I'm working on blacks also.
Oh, okay. There was an entire community of blacks in the Jodenbreestraat in Rembrandt's time, but released people that worked as sailors, and there was above all a very influential woman that caused quite some. She was very active. I mean, they married. We have the addresses. But there was also riots going on there, you know, a crowd of black people, in the street having a discussion or a fight with the former owner of slaves. So simultaneously, some blacks managed to take their freedom. Others were dependent, and they stayed as house personnel up into the 18th century. We have images in the 18th century of Sephardic families with the black servant.
Oh, yeah.
So, Michael, thank you so much for. Anyway, thank you all so much, because I think today was such an important addition to our general view about the neighborhood where Rembrandt lived, what may have inspired him, and what it meant, basically. And you all added in such an amazing way to widen our scope. This is what I really feel in exchange of influence, images Rembrandt may have used, and what did it mean for him? You all raised the question. What do these models mean? And what is their role or function in his depictions? And as I feel, but please say if I'm wrong, his message was, in the end, the Old Testament is replaced by the New Covenant. And,
Of course. Yep.
and did he have a special bond to Jews or others? He was fascinated as an artist. That's what I believe. He was mostly fascinated as an artist. And we can't, in my
Yes, I
view.
think that Shelley's closing statement kind of balances against the preceding points. I mean, you will agree, Shelley, that it is speculation, those connections that you make between Midrash and Mishnah and details in Rembrandt's work, which are wonderful to contemplate. But in the end, it's Rembrandt with his brush, his pens and his needles, who is letting his imagination do most of the work.
Absolutely. It's a common, that's why but you have to understand within the period of time, like when the book came out, the Rembrandt's Faith book came out, there was a critic at the Jewish Forward who went through and said, well, this is wound wrong. It's the talus is not. And I wrote to him, I said, what Rembrandt is doing is coming closer than anyone else in history.
No, it's not true. It's not true.
In the sense I meant before, of his time, yeah. And it was not for Jews. He created it for Christians. And to them, it sure looked like it.
Yeah.
Well,
good enough, plausible authenticity.
Romain de Hoog's drawing of a circumcision ceremony, which really is very authentic. You realize.
Oh, you're talking about that.
Okay, let's give other people a chance to talk to each other and ask questions, please.
Можно я спекулятивное предложение?
May I make a speculative proposal on Shelley's conclusion? Of course, I would like to say by saying a huge thank you to everybody. And I think, Shelley, what do you think? The son of Millman, he could have watched the kosher flour being made of a competing firm. You were talking about Halle. Could Rembrandt have seen it? But how? In a consciousness of a mill's son, how could he have not been interacting with these special products? Of course, he had interaction with kosher flour. And I wanted to ask Stephen Nadler, in 1936, the first catalogue of Resonnet came out of Northern artists, indicating that Rembrandt, well, there's a supposition. Again, it's very speculative at this point. Went broke because he gave his money to Menasseh for his alchemistry, Kabbalic experiments. Where could have this assumption stemmed from? What do you think? Well, because we do say it's not confirmed by any documents, but it could have, it must have stemmed from somewhere. Because it's documented, because with the same sort of intonation, it's an assumption, it's completely a speculation, but this is 1836.
Steve, you're muted.
Well, no, I haven't said anything yet. I'm still digesting that. So
Вы могли бы Стивену перевести? И второе, я хочу спросить.
And the second question to our first presenter, when you were talking about segregation in the cemetery, and Mirjam did say that there were Black Christians and they were converted to Christianity, and most probably, could you have had segregation on the cemeteries those that did not accept the Christian faith and those that were Christians and could have been buried together with others.
May I respond? Sorry.
Please do. I don't.
No, Nina. No, Nina. Sorry, maybe it was a mistaken translation. Some of the black servants became really Jews. They converted to Judaism. They became active partners of the Jewish community. That's what I told in my talk. And then some of them were buried at the Jewish cemetery.
Вот я про это и говорю.
That's exactly what I was talking about.
So not to Christianity.
In your presentation, you said that there was some segregation for the blacks at the cemetery, perhaps those that were not converted into the...
Yes, there was segregation. And
yes, but Mirjam, correct me if I'm
Сегрегация по
wrong.
какому признаку?
But what kind of segregation? Was it religious segregation or was it by the color of their skin?
So some of them took the Jewish face of their masters, if I may say so, actively. So they became really Jews.
И тогда их все равно хоронили отдельно.
And then were they still buried separately?
That was a whole issue. There's Lydia Lagort wrote a wonderful book about it, an extensive book about it. I have it right here. There was always a complicated situation. So Eliezer, who was talked about today, he was like a prominent member of the Jewish community. He was considered as part. He was donating money on funerals, and he was buried next to, well, it says bond servant, good servant, but he was like a companion and a respected member of the community. But there were also many regulations. So it's a very complex.
Ronnie Beer wants to know what that book is that you just held up. I want to.
Oh yeah, that's the book written by Lydia Hagort. Sorry, it's only published in Dutch, I think. Betreim.
Very good.
No, it's on the Beit Chaim Cemetery.
Yes.
Okay.
It's on those.
It's only published in Dutch, but this
only in Dutch on the burial registers. It's only to the 1630s, I think, right? It's an amazing text.
It's an amazing research.
It's just transformative. It's transformative, right?
Yeah.
But can I just get back to the question a little bit, making sure I understand it as well. So, and Mirjam, please correct me if I'm wrong. So that my understanding is that at the beginning, because Eliezer dies, he's buried in 1629, I believe, right?
Yeah.
And it's unusual. He's in that more prestigious section.
Yeah.
But he's kind of an outlier.
Yeah.
And you do by 1647, I think this is the question. By 1647, there's a designated area of the cemetery that is segregated for blacks and mulattoes.
Yeah.
All of those people have to have converted to Judaism.
Exactly.
Otherwise, they wouldn't be there. But the other thing that Jonathan Sorsch has studied in his really important books on Jews and blacks in early modern Europe, I don't remember the title, is that increasingly, as we know in general, slavery becomes associated increasingly with blackness, because it wasn't necessarily previously. It becomes exclusively associated. And the Sephardim, who interestingly, Peter Mundi, already in 1640, he is describing them as black.
Yeah.
The Sephardim they try to dissociate themselves more and more from the blacks. That's how you get that segregation of the cemetery, that really unusual circumstance of the burial of Eliezer from the earlier period. And also, it was, I think it's a kind of biblical legal requirement to convert your Jews to Judaism, your slaves to Judaism. And what you see is that increasingly they do not do that. They do not want to be associated with the Black population.
In fact, there's a very interesting story that happened just around the corner with Rembrandt. There was a Sephardi woman who took with her from Portugal or Spain, apologies, I forgot, her young servant, a Catholic young girl. She took with her to Amsterdam. So there was this widow living with her young servant, and this young servant converted to Judaism, and she took a Jewish name. And what happened? The mother of this servant sent from Spain two kidnappers to get the girl back to Catholicism. And it became a right. And actually this woman with the servant was living above the printery of Emmanuel Benveniste. So two guys from Spain came to bring the girl back to Catholicism, to Spain. And then the whole entire Jewish neighborhood, they were involved. So there was a huge fight. And the Jews basically took care of it, and they chased the kidnappers away. And the girl, named Hannah, after her commitment to Jewry, she stayed with the widow. And the widow even left her possessions to her, and she redid it later when the girl married, and she gave her a dowry. So this was a Christian Catholic girl from Portugal, Spain, who came as a servant with a Sephardic Jew to Amsterdam. So this is what happened, because they came as home personnel with them, and sometimes they took, they made Judaism theirs.
Well, this is wonderful that we're investigating the boundaries that we used to think were so firm, and that turned out to be very permeable, and all kinds of the categories with which we deal as historians, certainly the ones having to do with identity in an age like this, should not be cast in iron. And our awareness of the crossovers is extremely important, and we try to keep that in mind and looking for passageways between groups and things. Okay, who else? Shelley wants to say something.
Yes, I wanted to say a few things because Mirjam said so many fascinating things. So I just want to add to it. The whole issue of conversion is very interesting, because there was a time when the Muhammad, I think it was the 1630s and then in 40s, they were afraid because the Jews, the Sephardic Jews, were criticized because of the conversions of the slaves.
Yes.
And they were afraid that they would be kicked out of the United Provinces for this, because when they agreed to come, part of the regulations was that they would not convert people to Judaism. So it's a tremendous problem for the Jewish community, because they want to reach out, but they have to be careful, because they've been kicked out of so many cities on their way to Amsterdam that they don't want to be expelled. And then the issue with the cemetery is very interesting, because yes, you're absolutely right that the Black Jews were buried on the periphery, but that was also done by the Christians in their burials. So what the Jews wanted to do was imitate the Christians. I'm not exonerating anybody, but put yourself in that situation. It's a perilous situation. You don't want to be kicked out.
One of the questions in the chat was, how were the relationships between the Sephardim and the Ashkenazim at the time? Well, they were terrible.
Yes, in the beginning it got better, but yeah.
Well, it didn't get better actually, because I have a source from a Sephardic Jew from 1683 who describes how he thinks about Ashkenazim, and it's truly, it's horrible.
Yeah.
Nothing new under the sun.
Weren't allowed to eat,
Exactly.
to eat meat
Used
that
to be,
came
I don't know anymore.
Yeah, Joseph Kaplan has published extensively about this subject. I have a question for the audience. One of the paintings that was shown by Michael and by Shelley is the painting in the Berlin Gemälde Gallery of a young man who has always been called a young Jew and certainly looks that way. That painting, even though it's been accepted as a Rembrandt in all catalogs up to the Rembrandt Research Project, is not mentioned at all in the corpus of Rembrandt paintings. And the curator in the museum asked Ernst van de Wetering, the last leader of the Rembrandt Research Project, why, and she didn't get an answer from him. Does anyone have any idea what could be the possible objection to accepting that painting? Okay, Shelley knows. Tell me.
I'm sorry, I don't know exactly, but I remember that I went to a conference and there was a person who worked on the painting, and she said that she uncovered a date, and it was very late 60s. And I hadn't heard it. I went, wow, how could, we're all so used to the wonderful, convenient date of 1648. This was quite a jump. And I haven't heard anybody address that. And she swears that she found that date when she did the cleaning of the painting. Does that strike a bell with you, Mirjam?
No, but we'll have to get more information from them.
Yeah, I mean, that's all I could add to it. It's very curious.
May I pose a quite challenging question to all of you after today? Your amazing lectures and so much food for thought, but maybe first to Steve, but actually to you all. Steve mentioned the illustrations for the Piedra Gloriosa that Menasseh made 1655. There are two sets of illustrations, one by Rembrandt and one by an unknown person who always was said Salum Italia, but it doesn't seem likely to me because 1655, it looks like Salum Italia already moved away from Amsterdam in 1649. I found where he lived, by the way, and he was renting a room. You know, he wasn't doing too well. He was complaining about money. So there's two sets of illustrations, and I'm so curious. And thank you, Steve Nadler, what you did in publishing sources. There's two sets, and we always assumed there was the Rembrandt one and a correction. What if I asked Gary last week, and he said, yeah, there was a reason why we can't think like that, but I want to vote, but he didn't remember that.
Yeah,
at that moment.
I reached that.
Okay, so I asked Steve, you shared all the information with us that Menasseh said that he made illustrations himself on plate. I looked really into the words again. He says in plate. Sure, he wasn't an artist, and why? Hypothetically, would it be possible it was the other way around? That the second lousy, in terms of artistic experience, said, why can't we consider it as the first?
One other element that's curious is that in all of the reproductions anyway, the four images, which are quite smaller on a single plate.
And they fit much better in the books. I basically last week I looked back into the photos I have of the books in which images are kept. The Salum Italia, the second print, they fit in the book, as Adrian Offenberg already mentioned.
Well,
Rembrandt.
we're certainly exploiting this commission by printing the sheet with all of the images and selling that as a separate product. And
Yeah,
also
because Rembrandt's images don't match.
going
They
through
don't.
your states. Okay, Steve, you tell the question's addressed to you.
So the
Yeah.
question I raise is, can it be the other way around, hypothetically?
So let me just clarify the question. So your suggestion is not simply that the Italia engravings are Manasseh's guides for Rembrandt, but rather these were the ones that Menasseh intended to be included in
I
the
wouldn't
volume.
say the guides for Rembrandt. I hypothetically just asked, couldn't these be the first set?
So
They're so lousily done. I mean, they're artistically really incompetent.
so it's I don't see why that's not possible.
Wait a second. I broached it to you a year ago, and you said it wasn't possible.
Wait a minute. Wait.
No.
I want to. Can I interject before we go down that rabbit hole? I have a point to make, and if I'm wrong, that's fine. Just clarify it. Isn't it the case? Well, let's go back one step. So, as Steve shared,
By the way,
Rembrandt
I'm glad
makes
to know
an-
that I'm not allowed to say anything about this shit. I keep
No.
getting these questions, and I'm not allowed to say a thing. But go ahead,
You did
Michael.
in New York.
You
did.
want me to
You
wait?
made
All
that
right.
suggestion in
Okay,
New
Michael,
York
go
when
ahead.
we spoke at the yeshiva.
I just
Michael.
planted another bomb. Let's resync it.
no, I think it's great, but that's what I'm just trying to get this out, and then if I've misunderstood or I'm misremembering, that's fine. But the Rembrandt prints, two in particular, undergo a number of pretty dramatic changes, as
Yeah.
Steve mentioned, right?
Yeah.
So, and the other set, I won't call it second, is an exact copy of the last of the states of Rembrandt's versions, with I think the only difference is that the anthropomorphic rendering of God is excised.
No,
So if it's the possibility of Manasseh ben Israel's designs being those ones that we assume now are the second,
Mhm.
then how do you square that with the way that Rembrandt is making changes?
Yeah.
And then it's this other set that actually reflects the changes.
Yes,
And
Michael.
with Stephen's recent research that might connect it to the censorship of the book.
But another
Yeah.
thing in connection
But
to
Steve wants to talk.
but let me add one thing. They match better to what Menasseh describes in his text. The second set matches better to it.
Okay, Steve.
No, they don't. In fact, they don't. Only because Manasseh's description. So actually, let me go back. When I said it's possible, before Gary jumps on me there, what I was going to say is, remember, I'm a philosopher, so yes, it's logically possible. However, I think the material evidence, and Michael's case seems perfectly solid there, the material evidence counts against it. But going back to what Mirjam was just saying, the Rembrandt's etchings do better match Manasseh's descriptions of the illustrations than the other etchings do, because Manasseh's description talk about God's hand and God's throne, which don't appear in the second set.
Isn't there the lying Goliath exactly the other way around?
We have a question from a new participant, Roman. Please unmute yourself and talk to us.
Mirjam, about your suggestion that Salome Italia left Amsterdam in 1649, and that was a reason that is impossible for him to make these illustrations. The history of Dutch printmaking, especially in Amsterdam, gave us examples. that the person who was absent in the city of Amsterdam for 9 years already, nevertheless, the prints were published by the name of this person. Yeah, that's a little bit later. That is the end of 17th century. And I'm talking about Adrian Schonebeck, who being in Moscow those times, nevertheless, we have editions where we have engraved text testifying it was edited and by Adrian Schonebeck. So
we have to be open.
David,
Okay, now
is in details.
Good. Now I'm going to ask Leah, in closing off the round table and the chat. Leah, were there any questions from the chat or the Q&A that you want to present to speakers?
Not really. There are several questions from Russian listeners whose questions you couldn't understand. And one of them is whether our speakers have ever seen the movie of Alexander Korda made in 1936, which is entitled Rembrandt. And do you know something about the materials he used to prepare this movie?
36, not 56.
What?
1936, not 56.
1936.
That's Charles Lawton.
Yeah.
So, and the woman who asked this question, Maria Gorchakova, I suppose whether you know the materials he used for this movie.
She probably used Van Loon's pretended diary of Rembrandt, but I don't know. I don't really know. Okay, I think we're going to let the audience leave now. And thank you for staying with us for so long, and looking forward to seeing you again next week and the week after, where we're going to continue our exploration into a subject that is so many-sided, so rich, and has so much to say about not only Rembrandt and Jews, but also the surrounding cultures and societies. So looking forward to seeing you all back. Thank you.